And thank you, by the way.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky, and welcome back to another episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. I am very excited to have Laura Kriska joining us. Laura, welcome.
Hi, Michael.
So, Laura, you are a consultant, speaker, author. You're an expert in the area of cross-cultural relations and bridging the gaps in diverse workplaces. Your clients include Fortune 500 companies across many continents, and your latest book, which we will touch on, is The Business of We, where you kind of share your framework for how businesses can close the gap between different cultures and build a more collaborative workplace and environment. And I thought we could start our conversation today with something that is quite striking about you. And that is that you were the first woman to work in the Tokyo headquarters of Honda Motor Company, or just as people know, Honda, right? Honda cars, although Honda does much more than cars. So I want to hear from you kind of how that happened, and maybe it'd be helpful to provide a bit of backstory. And listeners won't know, and those joining us won't know, but you and I had probably a nice little 5-10 minute conversation in Japanese when we first jumped on the call here together, which was really fun because I don't get to do that as much as I would like to anymore. But kind of take us back to your time, because you have a history in Japan, although you are American, you're in the US right now. Set the stage for us. Like, how did you get to the place where you ended up being the first woman to work in the Tokyo headquarters of Honda?
日本に生まれました。So I just said in Japanese, I was born in Japan. My parents were missionaries. So in fact, the United States considers me an alien. Like, officially, I'm an alien.
I remember in Japan getting my alien registration card, and I remember taking a picture of it and sending it to people, although I don't even know if I had a proper cell phone to do that at that time. But I remember sharing, going like, I actually have a card. The government thinks I'm an alien. Just such a weird concept. So yeah, sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
No, I love that. I forgot about that card. Yeah. So both the United States and Japan consider me an alien. But at the age of 2, I returned to the United States. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I had a pretty average American life, except that our family loved Japan and still does love Japan. My mom would cook rice in the rice cooker. We would eat with chopsticks, and there was always soy sauce on the table. And it wasn't like Japan night, right? It was just how our family behaved. We liked that kind of food, and my parents were familiar with it, having lived there. And this is the kind of integrated cultural experience that's happening more and more around the world, whether you're in Canada, the United States, Mexico, it doesn't matter where. There is just more cultural diversity in individual people and in families. And in fact, recently in some of my consulting sessions, I've been asking people the question, how many country-related identities do you feel closely related to? And this is an anonymous, I ask these questions anonymously using have you ever heard of Mentimeter? Do you know this, Mentimeter? No. Oh my gosh, it's such a great tool for consultants who want to gather data from people, from employees, from their customers. It's real time. It's kind of like polling, but you can ask very specific questions. So I asked this question, how many identities do you feel strongly connected to? And it's all self-identity, right? So if I were to answer that question, I would say 2. I am a US citizen. I've spent the majority of my life in America, but I love Japan. I've spent years in Japan. I feel very connected to it. So I would say 2 cultures, 2 national cultures. And more people answer the question with 2, 3, sometimes 4 different cultures. So in my family, there was this strong affection for a country that I really hadn't experienced for myself. And so I was curious, from a young age. And at 16, my family had saved up enough money, and we took our one and only international trip to Tokyo, to Japan for a month. And, 16 is a pretty impressionable age. And I just was so intrigued. You probably had something similar.
Very similar. Yes. Yeah.
Do you want to share what that was?
Well, I remember feeling this way multiple times. Actually, I did a trip with my father and stepmother to to Thailand when I was, I believe, 14 or 15. And
Mhm.
that was like just a huge
Yeah.
culture shock shift. And I'd spent years in the Middle East when I was younger, and then Canada. But when I was in Thailand, my brain exploded. And then ended up going back with Sam, cousin and co-founder here, to Vietnam when I was probably 15 or 16. Somehow convinced my parents to let us go, and that was just also a life-changing experience.
Wait, without adults?
Correct. Yeah. So Sam's a few years older, and yeah, it was.
And super responsible, I hope.
We were pretty good. We were pretty good, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot that goes into that story. But let's just say they didn't know
Okay.
all the details. But it definitely influenced
Yeah.
a lot of our future. And I remember feeling that way. And I love that question about where do you kind of connect in terms of like different countries? Because I certainly feel I have that connection with more than one country for sure. I often describe myself feeling more like an international citizen than a Canadian citizen. So yeah, I could see that
So
playing into
which countries would you say are the ones that you feel a strong connection with, if you had to list?
So yeah, no, I mean, I was born in Canada, so there's the connection to Canada there. I spent from 2 to 6.5 years old in Israel, so I feel a connection to Israel. Not the same way. It's interesting because I feel much closer to Japan than I do to Israel. Even though my first language is Hebrew, and when I came back to Canada, I had to learn to speak English.
Mhm.
So I mean that influenced me in many ways. Just I think a big one is just my appreciation for different cultures and languages and religions, and I just love the world. So there's those three for sure. But
Mm.
I really do feel I'm just the international like mindset and being a citizen of the world for me is
Mm.
something that I value a lot.
I What you just said is so great. I just love the world. What a wonderful, that should be your tagline. Do you have a tagline?
Yeah. Wait, no, let's.
I
I
just
gotta
love
turn
the
this
world.
back over to you, Laura, because
All
this
right, all
is,
right.
people can
Sorry.
hear me talking enough in other things that we put out. I really want to shine the spotlight on you. So you
Okay.
went to Japan, 16. It made a big impression on you. Fast forward us
Yes.
a little bit because I want to dive into a lot more. How did you end up working at Honda as the first woman or first non-Japanese woman?
It had to do with my college experience and Honda being based in Ohio. So I was on my way to Japan for a year as an exchange student, junior year abroad. I approached Honda. I made some connections, and I was a welcome lady in their showroom as a college student. I just did it on the weekends, a little short time, part time job. But it was these relationships that I built.
Yeah.
And so when it was time to get a real job, I went back to these folks in Marysville, Ohio. But by then I was much more clear about what I wanted, and what I wanted was to be in Japan.
Mm.
And so I said, I want to work in Japan. And they said, okay. And just at that time, a very senior Japanese executive had returned to Japan from, I think, 9 years managing Honda in Los Angeles. And he wanted a bilingual assistant.
Mm.
It was a stretch to call me bilingual then, but I was tasked with being his assistant in the executive secretariat on the 10th floor of Honda Motor Company in Aoyama, Tokyo. And that became one of the biggest experiences, most influential experiences of my life.
Yeah. Would you say that you really had to stretch yourself in that role? Because you mentioned you weren't bilingual, he wanted bilingual. So was that a bit of a stretch?
It, it was so far beyond my capacities.
Yeah.
It's kind of shocking. I was 22. I'd never had a real job. So I was both going through the culture shock of
Mm.
just being a young person going out into the real workforce.
Yeah.
And I was doing that in Japan. And I was doing it when I thought I knew everything I needed to know. I had that hubris of many young people
Sure.
because I had lived in Japan. I spoke pretty good Japanese then, but I was in so far over my head. I had no idea of what I was getting into.
And I asked that because I have a very similar experience of putting myself in a place where I probably shouldn't have been, but
Mhm.
the stars aligned. And I think that the lesson that resonates with me here, and I want to really kind of put forward for everybody who's joining us, is the importance of of asking. Like, you know, you
Mhm.
actually, you to go, for you to end up in Japan was a big step, right? For you to
Mhm.
be accepted as a non-Japanese, uh, essentially kind of landing your quote unquote dream job, or at least in your dream place. That
Mhm.
wouldn't have happened if you didn't take several steps to connect with people, and most importantly, to ask. And I think about so many consultants right
Yeah.
now who know that they want to get more work, or they want to generate some kind of additional business, or create relationships with certain people, but they're not willing to take that extra step, or to push themselves a bit beyond kind of their zone of comfort. And I think so much of the success that we all have in our lives comes when we're not just doing the things that we're comfortable doing. We stretch, right? So coming back to what you did, like you stretched, I
Mhm.
stretch, and a lot of that kind of that growth, and improvement comes when we get beyond, or go beyond what just feels comfortable.
I completely agree. I do want to ask you a question, but I'll say I think that I stretched out of ignorance. I was naive. And so many of us have that naivete worked to my advantage when I was 22, 23. But I feel in some cases people lose that as they get older. Do you feel that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. In my case, I was definitely naive about so many things, but I also brought a lot of what I would call confidence, or
Mhm.
maybe it's naive confidence. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna,
Mm.
we're gonna make things happen. I'm gonna be successful in doing this. But I mean,
Mhm.
I got knocked down so many times, and questioned myself many times, and so that was all part of the
Mhm.
process. But I think you're right. I mean, it's, you look at children, right? They don't know that, like, if they try to walk and they get knocked, they fall down, like they just don't even know that they can't do it. So they just keep doing it. And
Mhm.
that's what gets them to the place where they can do it. Whereas with adults, as we develop, if we don't see success quickly, it's very common for people to give up and just go to something that is more comfortable, or say, I can't do that. So to me, that is a good kind of distinction to make. And I think that one, if you
Mhm.
really understand it, you can embrace it and go, yeah, I'm
Mhm.
feeling some resistance right now in something that I want to accomplish, but that's natural, that's normal. It doesn't mean that I should not do it. It means I need to just keep pushing harder, or talk to somebody that's done it before, so I can get some input on what I need to do to accelerate my success.
That's great advice.
Yeah, so you're turning this around on me. This is a
I'm
podcast where
taking
I want to interview people like you to get your your kind of experience to share with everybody. You're very good at turning this around. So let's come back
It's
to
your fault for being interesting. Okay. I'm
uh,
just putting that on the record. Stop being so interesting.
thank you. So you're in Japan. You're getting that experience. I would
Hmm.
you've I mean, you're back in the US now, right? You've done
Hmm.
business, as you said, with your clients and for your clients, all across the world, in Europe and other places. When you think about the consultant, or the firm owner that
Mm.
also is looking to expand globally, or even just maybe they're in the US, or maybe they're in Europe, but they work with people of many different cultures, backgrounds,
Hmm.
religions, right, beliefs. What stands out to you? What do you think people need to be aware of, or where do you see people often making mistakes, or having kind of some shortfalls, and how can people improve that, or view things differently, so that they can create more successful relationships, and the outcomes that they desire?
So, the number one mistake people make is thinking that culture only relates to countries or nationalities. Culture is so much more than a person's identity in terms of their nationality or what passport they have. A culture, a person's individual culture, is made up of their gender, race, religion, also things like life experience, education, socioeconomic class,
Mm.
physical ability, their hobby, so many things. So when I talk about culture gaps, I often, my job, my work, my life's work is helping people bridge culture gaps, help them build trust across any us versus them culture gap. But that idea of culture, again, can be so many different things. So let me give you an example of that. I live in a house with 3 teenagers, and there's a generational culture gap. And the teenagers literally use a different language. They're like, I got a dip. That's sus, lit. And I'm like, what are these? I'm on Google, what do these words mean? Because I don't know. What is dip? Dip means I got to leave, But there are things that they know, and that there are social references. Their values are, technology. Oh my gosh, if I have a problem, I look for somebody under the age of 20 to solve my technology problems. They're digital natives. And so these are just predictable differences, inevitable differences that happen in generational gaps. So it's not just nationality gaps. So if you can think very broadly about gaps being related to all these aspects of a person's identity or a group's identity, that's the number one thing, is it taking a wide approach, a broad approach to culture. And then the second big problem people make is that they don't understand that some cultural values are invisible.
What do you mean by that?
So things are visible, right? The way people speak a different language. Let's use an example both of us know. In Japanese, when you say the word difficult, 難しい, right? 難しいですね. You say, oh, that's difficult. So it seems like that's pretty clear. But you and I both know that in Japanese culture, saying that's difficult doesn't mean what an English speaker might assume it means. So if I hear Michael say to Laura, Laura, that's difficult, Laura will say, I got to work harder, or I've got to get help to make this successful. But in Japanese, it's a polite way of saying, no way, this is not happening. So there's an invisible message to what you can actually hear. So there's so many examples of invisible data impacting people's day-to-day lives. So let me make this more applicable to a consultant. Say you're working with a certain group of people. If you don't share a lot of the cultural identity with that group, then you are more likely to make mistakes in your interactions with people. And those are often unintentional mistakes. So that it's simply your lack of knowledge that you might unintentionally offend someone, for example. Let me use an example. Okay, let's use an example of a race in the United States where the date June 19th, right? June 19th, I grew up in a very colorblind era, and June 19th had no meaning to me. Juneteenth was not a thing I'd ever heard of until only, when it was much too late. It just never occurred to me. I wasn't taught. And so June 19th is a very important day. Juneteenth is an important historical day in the United States, where the last slaves were finally informed about 2 years later, after emancipation, were informed. I think it was Galveston, Texas, where they were told finally, and was a big deal. And Juneteenth is celebrated in many places, and it's kind of grown in its importance. But it was something I had never heard of. And now it is. And now in some places it's an important day for people to recognize. It's certainly, so that's an example of, a date. You can use many dates, September 11th, December 7th, in terms of World War II. I mean, these are just random dates, but they're not just random dates.
Right.
They have there's invisible meaning. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because if somebody is saying, okay, I'm building my consulting business, I want to expand globally, or I just want to work more, with a lot of companies around me, and they're not all the same as I am in terms of, cultural background, or like there's different, right? So you would, one way to look at it would be that to really, let's say, understand, in our case, the Japanese culture and the way that things are done in a place like Japan, it takes years, or can take years, to like really understand all the nuances. What if somebody doesn't want to commit to that level of deep kind of thought and understanding every little nuance, and maybe they want to do business with more companies in India, but they don't want to learn Hindi, and they don't want to learn all about the history. Is there, if somebody's in a meeting or in a situation where it's not going to be long term, but they still want to approach it where the outcome can be beneficial and a great outcome for both sides, is there anything from your experience that people should be thinking about or can do in those situations where they're not going to commit long term to
Mm.
going deep, but they still want
Mhm.
to be respectful and to have the outcome that they desire?
Absolutely. There are ways to fast track your understanding. In fact, I use a series of 10 questions. It's
Mm,
called the us versus them self assessment. They're 10 yes or no questions. Anybody can access these questions for free on my website, which is just my name plus.com. And these 10 questions ask how much interaction and how much knowledge do you have about this other cultural group? And the
mm,
other cultural group can be as big as a country or as small as a single person.
right.
And if you answer these questions honestly, you'll get a score. And if your score is low, you got to do some work. You got to put in some time. It doesn't mean you have to invest years. So,
Sure.
the way to fast track your understanding is through three categories of action. There are safe actions, challenging actions, and radical actions. So, safe actions are things like going on YouTube and Googling, doing business in India, or learning how to introduce yourself in Hindi. You don't have to become fluent in another language, but
Mhm.
really learning one word or how to introduce yourself is a reasonable investment. Maybe 10 minutes, 30 minutes at the most if you're really struggling.
Yeah.
If you're trying to show respect for another group of people and you're trying to do business with them, I feel like it's the least you can do to demonstrate your willingness um, to connect and to make it more equitable. Not expect everybody to kind of play on your field, if that makes
Sure.
sense.
No, I mean, it's
Yeah.
complete sense. So two things that you mentioned that really stand out to me. The first is just by even like thinking about asking that question, whether someone's going to go through your 10 questions, just the idea of like asking
Mhm.
yourself a few questions, like how much do I really
Yeah.
know about this person or their
Mhm.
background or where they come from, just even gets your mind to start like recognizing that, hey, maybe there's something that you don't know, maybe there's something that you can do to get a little
Mhm.
bit closer. And then on the language one, I mean, that's so huge. I remember seeing in Japan, people come in, and even people that have been in Japan for many years and they didn't speak Japanese. I was like, how can you live in a
Mhm.
country
Mhm.
where you're surrounded by a different culture, a different language, and you've made like no attempt to learn it? Like, just, it didn't, and I'm not saying they're wrong. It's just, it didn't make sense to me. And I think that even if you're going to do business in any country or with a different person, or it's just such a
Mhm.
great way to build a bond or to show that you care. It's like, hey, I've spent a few minutes to learn how to say hello or introduce myself in your language. That's just
Mhm.
so different because most people don't do it, that it can really create an advantage for you.
Huge advantage. Absolutely. And so then I'll tell you about these two other categories, which are challenging and radical. Radical is more like you just dive in. You go to that country and you really are learning. And that's usually takes more time, it's more expensive. But challenging actions are just face-to-face interactions of increasing depth. So, so I'll give you a real example. I had an invitation to work in Brazil several years ago, and I'd never worked in Brazil. I don't really know anything about Brazil. So I took my own advice and I took the 10 questions, and my score was very low. And I looked in my network for someone who knew more than I do. I
Mhm.
did my own research. That's safe, but
Yeah,
you've got to interact with humans. You've got to
totally.
have the challenging actions require some vulnerability. You might mess up. It's a little risky. But in my network, one of my husband's friends, his wife, is from Brazil. And, I wrote to her and I said, I'm going to work there. I've studied some things, but I'd like to learn from you. And I'll tell you, Michael, in my entire career in my life, whenever I've approached somebody from another cultural group, no matter what it's been, when I have said with respect and genuine curiosity, I want to learn from you, I have never once been rejected.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that's such a great idea to. So if we take our example of, let's say, doing business with somebody from India,
Mhm.
um, you could look at your network and just see, who do you know who's from
Mhm.
India, right? Or who do you know that's
Mhm.
spent time there, and ask them some questions like, is there certain things I should be looking for, or is there a
Mhm.
certain way that people make decisions, or just exposing yourself to that can teach you so much and really, again, give you an advantage, but make you so much more, I think, successful overall. So I really appreciate that advice. Uh, I want to then take us a little bit further down the path. You struck out on your own to become a consultant. At what point did you do that, and what was that transition like in terms of you going from working for somebody else to then working for
Mhm.
yourself?
Well, I was working for Honda for 5 years, and I realized that I don't really like cars that much. I don't like to drive them. I'm just not, and people in Honda love cars. It's like their dream job to do that. And I wasn't part of the kind of the business. Like I wasn't part of what was really important in that organization. And I wanted to be at the center of whatever organization I was part of.
Mm,
It seemed more fun. And after publishing my first book, The Accidental Office Lady, it provided a platform for me to be the center of that because my work is helping people navigate these different cultural groups.
mhm.
And I had done that. And so I helped other people do that. And with the new book, I'm helping all kinds of different us versus them, silos and gaps get closed. So it was that wish to be at the center, and it was publishing the book that really provided that opportunity.
And so did you launch the business as a consultant in Japan, or did that happen when you came back to the US?
It came back, it happened slowly. I actually left Honda and taught Japanese for a couple of years. I was working on my book, but I was not confident that it would
Mm,
ever become a book. I didn't think about becoming an author. I was still very young, but I had a lot of data, a lot of letter. It all came from letters that would
mm.
never exist today, right? I used to type letters to my parents once a week, and they were full of the details, the anecdotes of life in Honda Motor Company, the
Mm.
uniforms that we wore. Did I mention this? That women only uniforms?
I've seen it firsthand. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
pretty
not my favorite.
shocking, or yeah, just very different, right? Yeah.
But just all those details, the failures, the successes, and because I was writing to my parents, there was no filter, right?
Right.
It was all the especially the failures. And so when I came back, my mother had put all of these letters in a kind of folder, a notebook, and it looked like a book, right? It had this weight, and that's when I realized, oh, maybe I can write a book. But I
Mm.
still didn't have the confidence. So I was working at Honda in Ohio and writing on the weekends. In the evenings, I'd go straight from Honda to the library. I'd eat my dinner in the car, and I was so inspired. It was an exhausting schedule, but it was so invigorating because I was doing something that really excited me. And then I spent 2 years at Columbia University here in New York. And that's what brought me to New York. And
Mhm.
that's where I really polished the writing. I had a story written, but I,
Sure.
I didn't really know how to write. I hadn't really studied that before. But those 2 years at Columbia really helped me understand how much I like writing and putting my experiences and other people's stories into a book, and that's when the book really gave me the platform, and I think you probably experienced this as well,
Sure.
having that kind of um, document to share with others offers some credibility that if you don't have it, it's much harder.
Walk me through then, what did you do to get your first clients? You have this book, right? Your
Hmm.
first book. You're back in the US. You've been in the US then for at that time for several years. Uh, how did you go about getting your first clients, building the business? Like what did you do?
Well, there was first another consulting company that I worked for,
Mm,
and they had started kind of building up a business. And I wrote to them and I was like, hey, I could be your New York person. And they were like, great. And so I did that for many years.
mm.
And this was also when I was starting a family and kind of balancing all of that. And then, uh, oh, I guess it was in about 10, 11 years ago, I decided that I wanted to go out on my own. And that was a little bit scary, but I was also again invigorated by the experience of just, having success with clients
Mm.
and having a lot of relationships by then that had been built up. So that's
So,
yeah.
so when you launched that business after working at this other consulting firm and then deciding you're going to start your own consulting business, how did you actually launch it? Did you just send emails to the people that you had relationships with and said, "Hey, here's what I'm doing"? And especially, I'm interested, with because you're doing a lot of cross cultural work. There's still a connection
Mhm.
to companies in Japan, potentially
Mm.
contacts in Japan. Um, for those who also have had these kind of careers where they've built relationships with
Yeah.
people over the years, but now they want to benefit from that in their new business. What did you learn during that process? Like, what would be the best
Mm.
practices, and kind of like, what did you do? If there was anything that you did that you think worked exceptionally well, or anything that you feel just didn't work at all, what would your advice be on kind of leveraging and reactivating those relationships to grow your business?
So I was in the tricky position that some people might also be in, where I had to take a year off. I had a non-compete written into my contract with the other
Mm,
agency, and that was really scary. And it was also 2008 when things really fell apart. I had my third child, and I really went about it much the same way I went about going to be the first American woman in Honda. I really went into it kind of naively. I didn't do a lot of, I think the thing that I did well is that I had built up good relationships with the people before I left. And then for
mm,
a whole year, I was unavailable, by agreement. And then after that year passed, I was permitted, I had met my agreement, and I contacted everybody and I said, I'm available. This is what I'll be offering. And every single client, with one exception, returned to me.
mm,
And that felt really good. And this was,
right.
2009. I had
Yeah.
no idea if anybody would come back, if I'd have any type of business at all. And during that year, they had continued with the other agency with someone else, and they decided they wanted to work with me. And that, if there's anything, I didn't do it deliberately, but I had good relationships and I did a good job when I was working for the other agency, so that when it was my turn to be on my own, I was blessed to have the almost all of those clients return.
And when you started offering your services, um, how do they look different today compared to when you
Mm.
first launched the business and engaging with clients? Like, is there anything that you've changed in how you deliver services and how you work with clients? I mean, of course, we've been
Yeah.
going through the pandemic, and so a lot more virtual. But is there anything in terms of like your core service offerings that you've shifted over the years? And if so, I'm very interested to hear why.
Yes, the core offering was Japan versus the United States, and now it's really any us versus them. Uh, my services have changed because of COVID, so that I'm doing more. Of course, I did a lot of virtual things during the past 2 years, but I have found some things are better virtually.
Mm,
So, for example, I mentioned that tool called Mentimeter, which is this polling app. It's free. And so I can ask the participants when I'm working with them questions, and people use their phones
right,
individually to give anonymous answers. So I will incorporate that into my live training sessions
right.
moving forward. Another key part that's changed is um, I do an exercise called the team machine. It's a simulation exercise
Hmm.
that really gets people excited about collaborating. Collaborating inside one organization, which is hard. It's hard to get sales and marketing to work
Hmm.
together, to get legal and audit, or whoever it
Sure.
is, or Houston and New York, or
Yeah.
Tokyo and Sao Paulo. And this simulation activity, which I've kind of done sporadically over many years, is a big focus now because it gets people excited and
Hmm.
engaged at a time after 2 years of people not being in the workplace. It's a great fast track to excitement and engagement. So that's something I'm really looking forward to doing again in person.
I want to ask you before we get closer to wrapping up here that in terms of the work that you do, because you have clients in different time zones.
Mm.
You said 3 kids, like you have a lot going on, right? The new book, all that kind of stuff. Is there anything that you do in terms of a habit or ritual that you find is really critical to your productivity and
Mm.
performance and just being able to, to be successful in your business?
Meditation.
Mm.
I do TM meditation.
Okay, so that's
Uh,
transcendental meditation.
yes, yes,
And
I
when
learned
do you
it.
do it?
Well, ideally, you do it twice a day.
Okay.
I'm very dedicated to once a day at 6 o'clock. There is
AM or PM?
PM
Okay.
PM. The man I learned from is Bob Roth, and he's a really influential TM teacher here in New York. And he has a free call. He has a live meditation every day.
Mm.
And so my husband and I are pretty dedicated. We're pretty loyal.
Nice.
We'll both be working, and we're like, "Are you going to meditate? Are you going to meditate?" And it's nice to have a partner to meditate with,
Yeah.
because we kind of keep each other accountable. And we meditate almost every day at 6 o'clock together in this virtual group. We just call in, and Bob
Right.
Roth will share some thoughts, and then you do your 20 minutes and share some more thoughts. But it's a really lovely, totally free practice for people.
So you're not the first person to. I love asking this question because it's nice to kind of assemble the best practices
Mm.
and kind of performance hacks or just habits, mindsets that people have that contribute to their success. And meditation has certainly come up more than once. But for you specifically, what do you find it helps with? Like what's the reason to really continue doing it and
Mm.
have it as a habit?
Probably two main things. One is that it's just a stress relief.
Mm.
Just any stress that I have built up during the day, missed things or deadlines or whatever it is, can really be managed with that 20 minutes for me. And
Right.
the other thing is, I get some of my best ideas. It's really kind of uncanny. I'll be, mulling over a problem, and you're really letting go of your thoughts, but not every day, maybe once a week, something surfaces during that meditation.
Yeah.
Or I'll say, sometimes when I'm really struggling with a problem, I'm looking for a solution, and I'm really, usually something that requires a lot of thought, like something creative, but I want something practical out of it. I will just go meditate
Yeah.
sometimes with that problem on my mind. So those are the two reasons. Before meditation, that end of the day stress was met with a glass of wine. And I don't drink wine like that almost ever.
Right. Right. And
Much
then
healthier.
another question for you is, in the last 6 months, what's the best book that you read or listened to? It can be fiction or nonfiction. Just anything that
Oh
you
my
feel is really
God.
something that you'd recommend to others.
So many books. I've really I've been on a journey myself to learn more about the us versus them racial gap in the United States. And I've learned a lot from many, many authors. One, oh God, there's so many. There's so
It's a hard
many.
question. Yeah. Just one that comes to
All
mind.
right.
Yeah.
I would say The Wake Up by Michelle Kim. I don't know if you're familiar with her
No.
work. She is an activist and a teacher and a writer, and really digs into diversity issues, and keeps really tries to educate people. Uh, and I've learned a lot from her. And so her book, The Wake Up, was one of my there was a really important book that I read in the past 6 months.
All right. Well, we will have that linked up in the show notes. Laura Kriska, thank you so much for joining us and coming on here today. If people want to learn more about your work, your book, is it laurakriska.com is the best place for them to
Mhm.
go?
Yes.
All right. We'll make sure that's linked up as well. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Michael.